fell deeds awake.
Now for wrath, now for ruin, and the red dawn!
Hey there, it's me, Aiden again. I wasn't really sure how to start this video, so I figured I'd take a page out of old Warner Brothers marketing strategy guidebook and nostalgia bait you right off the bat. All facetiousness aside, I wanted to take a second today to talk about the latest Lord of the Rings movie, The War of the Rohirrim. This also marks the first theatrical Lord of the Rings movie in over a decade. And when I say over a decade, I really mean by the absolute closest margins. Now, before we get into talking about the movie itself, I did want to circle back to that comment I made about the marketing strategy and talk a little bit about the lead up to this movie. Lord of the Rings is an immensely successful IP that Warner Brothers has been sitting on for a long time now, especially in consideration of the modern age of sequels and reboots. So even though they don't hold the film rights to anything other than The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the fact that they haven't tried to squeeze a story out of the appendices sooner is honestly kind of impressive, all things considered. This film was announced back in 2021, and while I was curious about what a Lord of the Rings anime might look like, I was also pretty excited for it. As I've mentioned in other videos, I am a big fan of bold format risks and exploring relatively underappreciated and underdeveloped stories and themes. So an animated movie about Helm Hammerhand sounded like a good time to me, albeit it did seem like an odd choice for the first foray back into Middle-earth movies after almost a decade of silence. But as I mentioned before, the nature of this being one of their biggest IPs meant only one thing, that the marketing around this movie was going to be absolutely littered with nostalgia bait. Now this in itself I don't entirely begrudge them, because this is an animated film, which in itself is actually wild if you think about it, that we actually got a theatrical release of an animated Lord of the Rings film. And I'm really not complaining about that. But due to the change in animation, and furthermore, Japanese anime, this left a desire to connect it to the original films to let fans know that this is the same world they knew and loved. That in itself is okay, but there were a few aspects of the marketing that really irked me. Mainly how every single promotional video had to start with a clip from the original trilogy. It started to get a little grating after a while. Like, take this TikTok ad that literally starts with a 1-second shot of Aragorn. That's it. For what reason? But what was a little more upsetting is the fact that the movie gave almost all of the credit to Peter Jackson, despite only being officially a part of the project as of June this year, which feels just like a blatant PR stunt to use his name to add to brand recognition. This does upset me, as the true credit to Kenji Kamiyama and Philippa Boyens feels largely ignored. There was also some drama between this movie and Rings of Power, which I don't really know a ton about, aside from some secondhand sources telling me that there was some drama online where somebody attached to War of the Rohirrim said something disrespectful about Rings of Power, which upsets me, but unfortunately at this point no longer surprises me. Additionally, some of the marketing around this movie, especially the tagline, "Peter Jackson welcomes you back to Middle-earth," has been construed by some to possibly be an indirect slight towards Rings of Power, indicating that this is in fact the real Middle-earth. But recent comments from Philippa Boyens seem to indicate that there is no rivalry between the two, and she sees their joint expansions of the world as a good thing. Now, I've rambled on long enough about the setup for the movie, but how about the movie itself? Now, I'm pleased to say that I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was a ton of fun and served as an interesting expansion to the history of Middle-earth, and more directly, the people of Rohan. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This is what I want to see more of in the future. Stories like these which stand on their own and help flesh out the world without making it feel convoluted. Getting to learn about new peoples and places is such a delight, and even with the limited rights Warner Brothers has with the addition of the appendices, there are plenty of stories left to be told if they can provide talented artists and storytellers with the tools and time needed to execute them. Now, for my first critique of the movie itself, I did just mention that artists need the tools and the time to execute a good story. And in this case, it is clear they did not have that. And that isn't just me being cynical. Warner Brothers flat out admitted that they rushed this project along in an effort to maintain their rights to the franchise. Since I'm not entirely clear on what the contract is, but I assume it's something akin to the Sony deal with Spider-Man, where if they don't make a movie within 10 years or something like that, they lose the rights and they go back to the estate. And while I think that for the most part, the story still did a really good job of hitting major emotional beats, I do wonder if the restricted time or budget affected the animation at all. Now, what I'm about to say sounds blasphemous, especially coming from me as someone who loves animation and at times even prefers it as a medium. but I almost think this movie would have been better in live action. And the sole reason I say this is because much of the movie revolves around these large-scale battles, the type we've seen executed flawlessly in previous Lord of the Rings adaptations. But unfortunately in this format, whether it was the lack of time to animate or just the artistic direction, I felt like all the battles fell a little flat for me. It was really hard to get a sense of scale, and oftentimes it was difficult to understand whether we were supposed to know whether the odds were stacked against one side or another, and it was tricky to say who was winning or losing in any given moment. Moving into spoiler territory, the first battle, for instance, felt really disjointed to me, because I couldn't get a sense of how large Helm's army was, and I didn't know if Wolf was able to destroy it, or if when he conquered Edoras he just drove them all away. Then that raises the same question when they go to the Hornburg. How many soldiers are left? None? How many civilians are there? We get a lot of shots of people in the streets, but it's kind of hard to tell if it's packed to the brim, or if there's only a few survivors, and that makes the stakes struggle a little bit. We assume the entire population of Edoras fled there, but it's kind of hard to say for sure. I'm planning on watching it again sometime soon, so maybe I'll get a better sense for it then. Speaking of the animation, I'll admit that it felt a little janky to me at first. The backgrounds were some of the most beautiful mosaics I've ever seen, and each landscape felt so detailed and full of life. But then the characters on top of it had very little shading or depth, and moved at what felt like an inconsistent frame rate that caused the fluidity of their motions to differ drastically. I don't think this was a huge issue, and I got used to the animation within the first 15 minutes of the movie, but again, it's hard to tell if this was a stylistic choice or a result of a compressed time or budget. I'd love to see more behind the scenes content for this movie, and just to be clear, I thought the end product ultimately turned out gorgeous. And not only did it look incredible, it sounded fantastic. Getting to hear the Rohan theme in theaters, among other Howard Shore medleys, was probably the highlight for me. The sound design was crazy, and honestly might have sounded almost too real at times, if that's a critique that even makes sense. Regardless, the Foley team behind this movie went absolutely berserk, and I love it. Moving a little bit into the story itself, I think they did a great job with characterization and world building. It's clear that the same team behind The Lord of the Rings worked on this, as you can feel the love for Middle-earth coursing through the movie's veins. One piece of attention to detail I noticed was that during the reusing of Theodred's lament from The Two Towers, they did swap out some of the lyrics, including the word Meduseld, which I think was a really nice touch, and also served as a fun callback to the movies. Speaking of callbacks, this film does have a few, which mostly felt fine for me. The only real heavy-handed ones came at the very end. Dipping into spoilers again, I want to talk/complain about the Gandalf scene for a second, if you'll indulge me. This line gave me horror flashbacks to that scene with Thranduil at the end of The Hobbit where he drops the most painfully obvious, yet situationally random reference to Aragorn I've ever seen. And this movie might have just one-upped it. First off, I wish both of these references could have just ended one beat earlier. The delivery is exactly the same on both of them, where they drop a vague hint that most people can piece together, and then they proceed to beat you over the head with the answer. Like, why couldn't Hera just leave it at, he goes by many names, and then show us the letter with Gandalf's symbol? I mean, I guess one option is because people might assume she might have meant Sauron, since Rings of Power has been using I have many names as a slogan for the character. Really effectively, I might add. But moving even deeper, and here's where I'm gonna get a little nitpicky. Why does Gandalf even want to meet with Hera? To discuss the rings that she saw two random orcs collecting for like a split second when she was searching for Helm? First of all, let's just assume that this moment was impactful enough that she stopped to be like, orcs gathering rings? Orders from on high? Strange. How did Gandalf find out? Did she end up telling someone about this? Why would she feel the need to? It just feels a little convoluted to me. Though, not enough to ruin the movie, but still, it just felt like a cheap attempt at nostalgia, and I just really wish that wasn't the very last thing in the movie, because it kind of just ends on a sour note. You know how you could have ended the movie with nostalgia bait without it feeling sour, though? By utilizing Miranda Otto! How do you bring back Éowyn herself to do the voiceover for the movie, and never even address it? It bothers me that most people who see this movie probably won't even realize it's her. The movie's even framed as a story she's telling someone. So why not throw in a scene at the beginning where you show Éowyn recanting the story to her children? And then at the end of the movie, when it cuts back to her, you can throw in your nostalgia bait moment of Faramir entering the room. Or heck, you could even have Aragorn visiting from Gondor. It would feel tacked on, sure, but I feel like it'd feel less out of place than the Gandalf tease did for me. Anyway, rant aside, I promise I really did enjoy this movie. I think that framing the story through Hera's perspective was a really smart move, especially considering what happens to every other major character in her family. She was a great protagonist, and I honestly wish they had leaned even harder into the Shield Maiden storyline. I think it's a really intriguing aspect of Rohan's history, and it makes Hera a very compelling character. I do wish that Freyloth had been involved a little more, maybe even serving as a deuteragonist, and maybe he was originally involved more. I hate knowing that this movie was rushed because I feel like there's always going to be questions like that will linger for me. Helm, however, was an absolute unit, and I loved every second he was on screen. There's a sense of mythic proportions to his character, and I think telling the story in an animated format actually adds to that factor, as you can have a scene of him fighting a troll with his bare hands, and instead of sitting there going, well, actually, you're just going,
you know what, hell yeah.
He feels like a larger-than-life character, and I think having him not be the protagonist honestly helps enhance his story and the legend and mystery behind Helm Hammerhand, Wraith of the Hornburg. Wolf was also a great antagonist. I went into the movie expecting the tragic villain who was only circumstantially the enemy, but nah, Wolf was a straight menace. That dude was pure evil, and I think they did a great job of showcasing his flaws and how revenge had consumed him. Also, his right-hand man Targ actually ended up being one of my favorite characters. I love how fed up he was with Wolf the whole time, and I thought their dynamic was really fun. Overall, I really did enjoy my time seeing War of the Rohirrim, even if I was the only person in my showing. In fact, I think I was the only person at my entire theater. This movie isn't anything groundbreaking, and that's okay. In fact, that's what I enjoyed the most about it. It felt like a fun adventure into Middle-earth that helps expand appreciation for the franchise without recontextualizing the future stories in any negative way. Now, the whole thesis for this video is that these are the types of stories I want to see more of in the future. The fact that we were able to get an original Lord of the Rings anime theatrical release in the year of our Lord 2024 feels nothing short of a miracle. And frankly, I worry that with the current lackluster box office, this might be the last time we ever see anything like this. I think the concept of a film like War of the Rohirrim stands as a good omen for things to come in the Lord of the Rings franchise. But the reception, which I do blame in part to a poor marketing campaign, feels like a bad omen that will continue to force the idea to executives that only through milking nostalgia and the same stories over and over again can they be a financial success. I really don't know what they have planned for the Hunt for Gollum, so I'll reserve my judgment for now. But it does feel much closer to the category of milking stories and characters the audience knows, regardless of if there is something worth telling. I'd love to see more projects akin to War of the Rohirrim in the future, and in the meantime, all I can do is sit and hope. I will say that this further reiterates my point that it really does feel like the best time to be a Tolkien fan in recent years. There is so much on the horizon, and as it currently stands, it still feels like the Tolkien projects are being helmed by those who love, understand, and appreciate his work. I'm extremely excited to see where it goes from here. Be sure to let me know in the comments down below if you've seen War of the Rohirrim and what you thought of it. Additionally, if you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to like or subscribe for more content like this in the future. Thank you again to everyone who has supported me thus far. This video marks almost 1 year since I first started making YouTube videos, and it's been a really fun journey. Never in my wildest dreams would I have anticipated some of the reaction and feedback I've gotten from you guys. I look forward to everything that's to come in the new year, and hopefully I can put out some more fun projects for you guys. But that's that. Thanks again for watching.